The Scarlet Plague by Jack London.
Hello, my name is Natalie, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the summary of this story. Well, this story takes place in the year 2073 in a beach where once used to be San Francisco. In this place, we can find our protagonist, James Smith, and his three grandsons, Edwin, Hurlip, and Huhu. They live in a very primitive world after the Scarlet Plague attacked. They dress in animal fur, their food is not as delightful as it was before, and their language and intelligence are very limited. The kids convince James to narrate how the Scarlet Plague devastated everything, and James agrees to tell them. It was the year 2013. He was a literature teacher at the University of California, and there were some rumors that a horrible illness was emerging. Some of the most relevant symptoms presented were convulsions, a rash that left people's faces all red, and a quick death. People died within 15 minutes and 1 hour, and due to this reason, scientists and biologists couldn't find a cure. James witnessed a case in one of his classes where one of his students died from this plague in the middle of the lesson. After this, the entire city became chaotic. Poor people started rioting and destroying everything, and rich people just left to the countryside. James decided to find shelter in the chemistry faculty of the university with other 400 people, and at the beginning this was alright, but sometime later the place was no longer safe and they had to leave. As the time was passing, all of James' partners died, and at the end he was the only survivor. He was living alone in the forest with a pony and some dogs that he adopted, and he was starting to go crazy. He decided to look for more survivors and he found a man's tribe, but he didn't feel comfortable in this place. The man, whose name was the chauffeur, was mean and rude, and he was an entire beast. So after some time, James decided to leave to another tribe where he finally settled down. There, he got married and had kids to repopulate the world. It is important to clarify that there was no communication within the continents, so they didn't know if there were survivors in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and stuff. At the end of the story, James tells the kids that he is pretty sure that everything is going to be the same in the future and everything is going to be as it was before. And that trying to change that destiny full of violence, evil, and war was completely pointless. Everything was going to be remaining the same.
Now, about his biography, he was born as young Griffith Cheney on January 12 in 1876 in the slums of San Francisco, and he died on November 22nd in 1916 in Glen Ellen, California. Jack London's San Francisco home has a collection of some of the 600 rejections he received before he sold a single story. Besides, he educated himself at public libraries with the writings of Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Like many aspiring writers, Jack London had many other jobs. These included paperboy, journalist, gold miner, coal shoveler, and vagrant. Well, this last one is not much of an occupation, but it landed him on jail. He then went to Japan as a sailor and saw much of the United States, as a tramp traveling on freight trains, and as a member of Charles C. Kelly's Industrial Army. This army is one of the many protest army of the unemployed. He also saw depression conditions, and as I mentioned before, he was jailed for vagrancy. And in 1894, he became a militant socialist. He wrote an early dystopian novel that influenced George Orwell. The 1908 novel, The Iron Heel, is widely regarded as the first modern dystopian novel, predating We, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, and 1984. He was the first author in the world to become a millionaire from his writing. Now, gold mining didn't make him a millionaire, but London's fiction would prove to be a literary gold mine. By the end of his life, he was bringing in over $75,000 a year from his writing. Now, nobody knows for sure whether he intended to kill himself or not, but his death certificate gives the cause of as uremia. Given the numerous references to suicide in his work, it seems likely that London intended to end his life, but we cannot be absolutely sure about that. He was an atheist, and he claimed, and I quote, "I believe that when I'm dead, I'm dead. I believe that with my death, I'm just as much obliterated as the last mosquito you and I squashed." Lastly, well, there's not really much information as to why he decided to write this novel, but he was really interested in the mysteries of microorganic world and partly in a critique of modern social structure. For London, the destruction that follows his plague is both to be welcomed and despised. Such total destruction forces class barriers to be broken down, but it also ruins civilization. London seems to support an evolutionary vision of society, and well, he can force his readers to feel desperation in the way he uses his words.
Okay, so now let's talk about the stylistic characteristics of the book. So one of the main things I would say is that this book was one of the first examples of post-apocalyptic fiction novel in modern literature. Even though it was published more than a century ago, the Scarlet Plague feels contemporary because it allows modern readers to reflect on the worldwide fierce pandemics. And his works often contain explicit critiques against capitalism and war. Okay, let's talk about a little bit about fantasy. So his imagination was pretty spot on, and his descriptions are vague enough to be accurate. It was fascinating to see how he made projections upon the progress of technology 100 years ahead of his time. For example, wireless radios being used for routine communications between regular folks, monorails to transport the masses overland, and private luxury zeppelins for the wealthy to travel. Yes, and finally, in London's vision, the apocalypse reveals that the war will go on and on in the same pattern, which somehow makes any human evolution sound unimportant, considering it would always reach the same peak. Yes, and now let's talk a little bit about illustration. So London presents his readers with degradation at two different levels. Firstly, it is a declining society unable to deal with the occurring crisis, which evokes the wars in all men. And secondly, the after-war with humanity turned into barbarians, forming a loose tribal society with no culture existing. Yes. Also, it illustrates the understanding of Darwinism on the example of the evolution of dogs after the catastrophe, the plague, and it explains the evolution as an adaptation to circumstances where the only fittest dog, the most adapted to the new conditions, can survive. Yes. The evolution forced all non-adaptive individuals to be brought out and resulted in the new, less diverse species with better prospects and abilities to survive. Yes. In addition, it recognizes that any society consists of the largest strata of civilized development of different classes, including the underclass described as a race of barbarians, and the upper class exploiting them greatly. For example, the Chufor tribe is a good example of London's playfulness with class and social hierarchy. Instead of handling the plagues as the great level, London does not use it to force equality, but uses the apocalypse to tip the scale and reverse it upside down, as in the situation of Lady Vesta Van Worden and her Chufor bill. Yes, and finally, the apocalypse that does not end the world completely. In fact, it ends the society and its entire culture and causes evolutionary throwback, creating the new world strikingly similar to the one that was here before. And the post-apocalyptic society is almost deprived of language, culture, and science, and any surviving remains of it are considered to be of no use, but lacking culture and human achievement throw humanity instantly hundreds of years back in time.
In comparison, we can see that in the book, the disease is more deadly in comparison with coronavirus. The scarlet rat will kill someone in less than 30 minutes if you are lucky to survive more than 10. On the other hand, if you get infected with corona, you might not die so suddenly. rather have more than 10 days. Besides, no one did survive the Scarlet Red in the book. Meanwhile, there have been more recovered people from corona than deaths. Maybe that is why at the Scarlet times, people were way too afraid to get infected than in corona times. We are way more relaxed. In the Scarlet Plague, the bodies were lying in the streets and buried. All red roads and vessels carrying food and such things into the great city had ceased running, and mobs of the hungry and poor were pillaging the stores and warehouses. Such was the situation as coronavirus first started, with the difference that there weren't dead bodies all around, nor people pillaging the stores. Well, maybe some. Let's say we were all buying as much food as possible so that we did not have to go outside. Unfortunately, there was a disadvantage for the unprivileged ones. In corona times, we can evidence that needy people are, as usual, the most affected ones. Nonetheless, in the Scarlet Plague, that wasn't the case. The poor ones rather struck out against the prosperous ones that had been dominating them since decades. And the figures of speech, we can notice that the author of the book usually has adventure novels. He takes or introduces some social problems, and the characters are always in jeopardy. Form of discourse. The form of discourse, we can find the narrative. Then we have the setting, and the final pandemic was the Scarlet Plague. Once you got the red rush, it was late. Victims died within hours, conscious the entire time, and when they died, their bodies decomposed rapidly. The disease was spread with the dust. Characters, James Smith, Edwin, Ho, Harlip. As theme, we have a survivor from the Scarlet Plague who tries to retell his story to his grandchildren and also to impart value in knowledge and wisdom. Conflict, was the professor going to die as well from the Red Death? As theme, we have a pandemic, and in the resolution, we have the value of knowledge is ignored by everyone.
Now let's talk about the thematic discussion. The Scarlet Plague presents and illustrates themes regarding the genre of post-apocalyptic fiction. In this story, civilization disappeared within an infinite cycle of creation and destruction that was unleashed due to a pandemic that swept away the world population, a cause of the enormous contagion that spread very quickly, leaving only an elderly man as a survivor. In the midst of this disaster, people began to lose control, and finally their survival instinct forced them to rebel in masses and to commit a series of crimes that provoked chaos and made everything get out of control. After being a survivor of this plague, Smith, the old man, looks back the great loss suffered that affected mainly nature and humanity, and how the earth was depopulated when this apocalypse took place. The only figures that remained were death and total desolation, as if a cataclysm had passed. London's work inspires reflection on the role of media during pandemics. In the novel, newspapers, wires, and phone calls were the only tools for obtaining information on epidemic spread. As London shows in his novel, pandemics can bring forth deeply rooted fears and modify human behavior greatly. In The Scarlet Plague, the author explored many traditional issues of a plague, ranging from a reaction on morality and justice to the contagion and clinical features of the disease. In particular, behavioral responses to a pandemic were highlighted, showing the emergence of fear, irrationality, and selfishness in a previously civilized and modern society.
In the novel, at the beginning of the epidemic, the people appeared not to be alarmed, because they trusted medicine to find a way to overcome the problem just as it did it before. But when medicine and scientific progress were defeated by the plague, fear took over the population. Consequently, capitalism is presented as the ultimate cause of the pandemic and thus harshly criticized. It demonstrates how society, when in crisis, tries to look for something or someone to blame, but not a real way out. The pandemic was perceived as the end of the world. The cities were being destroyed and their people were fleeing away in hysteria. This immense panic grew even more frightening and unprecedented because of the stopping communication with the rest of the world, and it was understood as a hopeless sign of death even when it was something that had nothing to do directly with it, because it was appreciated as the only way to keep track of the situation. But in comparison to our modern times, the media is usually exaggerating the risk of the epidemic, causing even more fear. It can be perceived that the author used the plague to criticize contemporary social structures, and it is portrayed how the destruction that follows the plague is both to be welcomed and despised. Indeed, as a conclusion, we could say that the public health awareness is generated and sustained just when the fear of a disease induces hysteria in the population as it is happening now. And also, this can lead to understand how this pandemic situation breaks the class barriers, but it also leads to the reign of civilization, where only human brotherhood enables society to survive. Also, it shows how the situation made humans revert to wildness, this changing absolutely what social interaction, which changed from something positive to a total risk and a normal life, could have meant. And of course, the reality that once existed would never be possible again.
Interactive activity. Read and follow the instructions. You can find the link in the description of the video. Thank you for listening. Feel free to ask us questions if you have any.